Hello, my name is Putkonen. Thank you for joining me. Today's topic is embracing reality, empowering change, the paradox of acceptance. Now, I'll explain as we go how it's not a paradox, but let's start with embracing reality. Embracing reality is basically totally unconditionally accepting what is as it is. This is a basic attitude for those that have realized non-duality. It is kind of a basic tenet, or ideal for those that are studying non-duality to try to accept what is as it is. And of course, why do we do this? Well, because in trying to fight reality, fighting what is, you're just causing yourself a whole lot of grief when reality always wins. No person has ever won against reality. Reality always wins. And so it's pointless to fight reality. And this could be things from the death of the body. Resisting and denying the death of the body creates all this suffering because we're fighting what is. But if you totally accept the mortality of the body and that the body will end, if it's totally embraced, there's no suffering because you're no longer fighting a fact. You're no longer fighting reality. And so embracing reality is simply just fully embracing what is and accepting what is as it is. And this is, like I said, a basic tenet of non-duality. Because, in non-duality, there's only the self. And so what are you fighting? What are you denying? What are you in conflict with? It can only be the self. Why fight with yourself? Why be in conflict with yourself? I would think it'd be far wiser to try to be collaborative and cooperative with the self. Because there's only self. And so you're trying to go for harmony. You're trying to act with what is. This leads to the last part. I'm going to talk about the paradox of acceptance. Because a lot of people misunderstand that if you totally accept what is as it is, this somehow means you're unable to change things. You're unable to act to change. But that isn't what it means at all. So I in the title I mentioned the paradox of acceptance, but I'm trying to clarify that this isn't a paradox at all. It's a misunderstanding. It's a lot like in terms of a great Aikido master. When I was in my young adulthood, I studied Aikido for several years. And it was drummed in my head because it was repeated so many times by the sensei. Never go force against force. Never go against the force. You must always accept it and, receive it and listen. Being receptive and listening was key in Aikido. Because as a force is coming in, if the natural reaction is to go, no, and defend yourself and go force against force, you're, one, expending a lot of effort. But two, you're not particularly listening to the incoming force. You are just going directly against it, trying to stop it. And then it becomes a battle of whoever's stronger. But if you are receptive to the incoming force and you're listening, so you embrace and receive this incoming punch, for example, you might, get your hand on the arm and gently redirect the force to miss. And then you would redirect into a throw. Because in Aikido, it's often you're throwing the other person with their own force. As the force is coming in, you're merging with it and redirecting it, and then throwing them with it. And that is the crux of what non-duality is about, is in the end living in the world like a great Aikido master. You're always receiving and listening to the forces coming in, and you're always trying to act with those forces to whatever ends you want. Because a great Aikido master doesn't just accept the punch and then take it in the face. That's not what accepting and receiving the force means. Accepting and receiving and embracing the force, the energy as it comes, means you merge with it. And then from there, you do what you can collaboratively and cooperatively to redirect the force into a more advantageous position. And so that's why totally embracing reality, totally accepting what is as it is, does not mean being unable to change anything. If something happens, you're walking along and you trip and fall down in a puddle, being totally accepting and embracing what is does not mean you live out the rest of your life sitting in that puddle. If it did mean that, how did they start walking in the first place? They would have never been walking unless, because they were standing still at some point. You get up in the morning, you're not moving. It's kind of a ridiculous assumption to mean, well, that means you need to accept unchangingly whatever condition you find yourself in. Well, that means if we wake up in the morning, none of us would ever leave the bed if we're following non-duality, which isn't the case. So like I said, it's more about, instead of acting in the world in a confrontational no way and fighting it and being in conflict, instead you are open, receptive, embracing what's going on, saying yes to it, and you are then acting cooperatively and collaboratively with the forces, with what's going on in the world, to make the changes you want to make. And so it's a different way of acting, because a lot of people's default is to say no and fight whatever's coming in. And so this is a change of viewpoint. It's to automatically say yes and embrace reality, accept what is, and then from there act. And that leads to the middle portion, empowering change. Because only when we fully embrace reality, only when we fully unconditionally accept what is as it is, are we empowered to truly change, to make change. I mean, think about it in terms if you're walking out in the jungle and suddenly you fall into a pit of quicksand. If you're following the no and conflict, what's really happening is you are splashing into quicksand. There's this no, and you're immediately thrashing and trying to get out and escape the situation, and you sink faster and faster until you drown. Because in saying no, and if you really look back into all your past experiences, when you say no and you're in conflict and fighting and resisting and basically not accepting what is, by and large, we are reacting to what's going on. It's fight and flight. And so if somebody falls into a quicksand, it's the fight combo, and we're trying to get out, and we're thrashing. How do we get out? How do we get out? And you're swimming along, and you're in tunnel vision, really, because you're frantically trying to get out, and you're thrashing, and you sink quickly. And that's what happens when you're not accepting what is, and you're resisting, and you're fighting. But what happens for one that is embracing reality, that is totally accepting what is? Well, again, they would fall into the quicksand, sploosh. And as that happens, there would be this, yes, I fell in quicksand. I totally accept where I am right now. What can I do about it? And so they might look around. Well, there's a low-hanging limb there. There's some vines over there. These are my options. What's the best option? And then you would act. And if you look around and there is no low-hanging limb, there is no vines. Basically, you're too far into the quicksand to reach the edge. You are stuck. Then you would just calmly sit there. And when you calmly sit there, you find you float. Because that's what happens with quicksand. Only if you're thrashing and trying to get out do you sink and potentially drown. But if you're motionless and it's kind of like water, you just float. You can just float along. And as you're waiting, because you're totally accepted the situation, I don't see anything that I can do about this right now, but everything's in constant motion, everything's constantly changing, variables are changing constantly at all times, and so you're just keeping your options open, looking around, going, let's see what happens. And then you catch perhaps a distant crack or something of somebody walking out a ways, and you can call out, hey, I'm in quicksand, I need help. And then you might be able to be rescued that way. But these are all through action. You're actually aware. You're listening. You're trying to work with the situation. As opposed to the tunnel vision you get when you're reacting and fighting what is. Because the person who's thrashing out of a quicksand, trying to get out, may not even hear people in the distance that they call help for. The options are more limited when you are reacting and fighting with what is, because your only option is to try to go against whatever force or energy that's coming on. But going back to the great Aikido master, if you're open and receptive and accepting the force coming in and you're receiving and you're listening to it, your options vary. You can redirect it in many ways. There's much more range of option to then act, to then consciously act and make change. And so change is empowered by accepting what is as it is. For really, the best change would be action instead of reaction. Reaction is not probably the best way for change. Because reaction tends to be fight, flight, comes out of our own conditioning. May not even apply to this scenario. The variables may be different than it was in the past. And so instead of doing that, you can just be openly receptive, listening, embracing reality, accepting what is as it is. It's like, yes, this is what's going on now. But what can I do to redirect and perhaps make things more advantageous or better or more fun, enjoyable? It doesn't particularly need a heavy meaning, but I mean, it's one of these things where action is better than reaction. Instead of coming out of conditioning and reflex, acting is the more empowered change. And the only way to truly act is to first accept and listen and be aware and really understand what's going on. Because you need to see deeply what's going on. And that just doesn't happen if you're reacting with no, and then it blocks things out. You're so focused on going against this force and trying to stop it, you've lost all the other options. So that's how embracing reality leads to empowering change. And that acceptance is not a paradox. Acceptance, which is what embracing reality is, does not mean one cannot act and cannot change. In fact, it empowers change and enables one to truly probably make conscious change in a collaborative, cooperative way with the variables, with the energy, with what's going on in a much more wise way. And I'll leave this way. I've mentioned this old Zen analogy before, but if a boatman is got 2 oars rowing upstream, there's a lot of effort as you're fighting the current. But when you use 1 oar as a rudder to steer, the entire power of the river becomes yours. And that's what it means to truly embrace reality. Because then when the empowered change is the entire force of the river becomes yours. Just like a great Aikido master, the force that's coming in from the punch becomes theirs, which they use to throw the person with little to no effort on their part. But the only way to have the ability to see the right moment, to use the right force in the right direction, in the right way, is to be fully aware. And to be fully aware, you have to be open and receptive, which you can only do if you fully embrace reality and accept what is. So, some things to think about. But if you got any questions, comments, please post below. And as always, thank you much.